Okay, so hola. Now, over the last several days, we've been working with direct object pronouns. Um, and today, what we're going to start doing is working a little bit with indirect object pronouns. So yes, there are two types of object pronouns. And as we move through this, we will be working to help you distinguish between the two. Most sentences with an indirect object also have a direct object. And you'll start seeing that, of course, very early on, but we will, as I was saying, be working so you can distinguish between which is the direct object, which is the indirect object, and how you work with each one as needed. With the indirect object pronouns, we're always going to be asking to whom or for whom something is being done. So one of the biggest differences, as you'll see shortly, is that indirect objects always have to refer to a person or an animal, whereas direct objects are often an item. So let's get started and get into a bit more detail here. So the first thing you need to remember, of course, is that a pronoun replaces a noun. We've been over this multiple times this year. And that the indirect object indirectly receives the action of a verb, as it said on the title slide, to whom or for whom something is done. So one of the things that you want to be on the lookout for is that you're going to see the words a, to in Spanish, to, or para, which usually means for. And one of these words will come directly before the indirect object in the original sentence. Now, that doesn't mean that every single time you see a or para, there's going to be an indirect object. But if you see a followed by a person or a name or an animal, or para followed by a person, name, or animal, that's a pretty good indication that you're going to be dealing with an indirect object that, at least for our purposes now, you'll be changing to an indirect object pronoun. Another thing to remember is that the indirect object must be a person or an animal. And just like in English, just like we use direct object pronouns in English, we use indirect object pronouns, otherwise known as IOPs or IOPs, as you'll hear me referring to them in English as well. So for example, we have the doctor gave the results to the patients. Well, to whom did the doctor give the results? Your indirect object in the original sentence is to the patients, and changing that to an indirect object pronoun in English means that we change the sentence so that it says the doctor gave the results to them. Our second example, Senora gave a quiz to me today. To whom did Senora give a quiz? Senora gave a quiz to me. So to me is our indirect object pronoun, be aware, in both our original sentence and the repeated sentence. So it's just really highlighting it there, but in some cases that is the way you're going to see it. In an example in Spanish as well, a mí, and then you'd have to change that a mí to the correct indirect object pronoun. Our third example is the nurses gave medicine to the patient. To whom did the nurses give medicine? The nurses gave medicine to the patient. So to the patient is our indirect object in the original sentence, and then when we replace to the patient with an indirect object pronoun, in English we have the nurses gave medicine to him or to her. Now you're going to notice here that the indirect object pronouns are very similar to the direct object pronouns in Spanish. In fact, they're identical with the exception of the bottom two. So keep that in mind, and if it's going to help you to highlight them or somehow make the difference in your chart more visible, I would advise that you do that. So we have to or for me is may, to or for you informal is te, to or for him, her, or you formal is lay, to or for us is nos, to or for you all in España is os, and to or for you all or them is les. So we have me, te, lay, nos, os, les. And so remember as well that the indirect object in a sentence is the person or animal to whom or for whom the subject does something. And so when you're working in Spanish to find the indirect object in the sentence, ask a quién, to whom, or para quién, for whom the subject does an action. And those two words on para are underlined because they're kind of a little hint for you to look for an indirect object afterwards, especially, of course, as we're doing activities like we are now to help ourselves get accustomed to using these. And finally, you also need to remember that the indirect object will never be an item. So if you see a or para and a thing afterwards, or a place, that is not going to be an indirect object. So we have the same examples here that we used in English earlier, and we see them in Spanish as well. So we started off with the doctor gave the results to the patients. El médico dio los resultados a los pacientes. We have the doctor gave the results to them replacing to the patients. Our answer in Spanish, el médico les dio los resultados. Les is our indirect object pronoun that is replacing a los pacientes. Our second example, Senora gave a quiz to me today. There's no change in the indirect object in Spanish. It's a pronoun, stays a pronoun, okay? So if she gave, so la señora dio una prueba a mí hoy. She gave a quiz to me. You will notice that the a mí from the original sentence here changes to me in the Spanish. La señora me dio una prueba. Señora gave a quiz to me. And finally, the nurses gave medicine to the patient being your indirect object in English. Las enfermeras dieron medicina. Oh, it should be a la or al or a la. Sorry, there should be a dash in between, and there is not. That's obviously my mistake that I'll have to fix for the future. Paciente. In English, we have the nurses gave medicine to him or her, replacing to the patient. And then we have las enfermeras le dieron medicina, le replacing al paciente or a la paciente. Las enfermeras le dieron medicina. Just like with direct object pronouns, these are typically used in the context of a conversation. However, for our purposes, we are only going to be doing find and replace with indirect object pronouns this year. So keep that in mind. You've seen a little bit of direct object pronouns with questions. You're not going to be working with indirect object pronouns in questions this year. Another thing you need to know as well is, follow the same rules for placement as direct object pronouns. They go before a conjugated verb in a sentence that only has one verb, or they can be attached to the end of an infinitive, so that original form that ends in AR, ER, or IR, or a present participle. And before you do the little practice activity on Página 3, I would like you to write down then these final examples here. We have a on Página 3 at the top, un enfermero dio muletas al paciente. A quién dio muletas el enfermero? To whom did the nurse give crutches? Al paciente. Al paciente is your indirect object. It gets replaced with your indirect object pronoun le. Un enfermero le dio muletas. B. Nosotros hablamos a los médicos. Now, this does not have a direct object in it, although most sentences will. This sentence does not have a direct object in it. It only has an indirect object. A los médicos is to whom we spoke or are speaking, okay? It's replaced with the indirect object pronoun les. So we have nosotros les hablamos as our answer. And finally, for C, we have la señora dijo la verdad a nosotros. ¿A quiénes dijo la señora la verdad? To whom did señor tell the truth? A nosotros, to us. So that is going to be replaced with our indirect object pronoun nos. And we have la señora nos dijo la verdad. Señora told the truth to us. Call me over if you need assistance with Página 3, and we will be going over all of this and durante la clase mañana. So during our next class tomorrow, whether it's tomorrow or 2 days from now, we will be going over this again. Gracias.